We have a great program today with Kerri Greenidge talking about her book, The Grimkes, and moderated by the Lincoln scholar Harold Holzer. This program today is also, it's co-sponsored by our partners, the American Women of African Heritage, and so we thank them also for sponsoring this event. Before we get started, I just wanted to tell you about two programs that we have coming up next weekend that if you like this kind of thing, please come next weekend too. We have one on Saturday the 25th at 2 p.m. with our partners, the American Women of African Heritage, have their literary celebration this year, and that's with Ginger McKnight Chavers, the novelist, and so that'll be right here as well, and the registration link is on our website. And then on Sunday, we have an opera concert. And some of you have been to our concerts here before. We have an opera concert with Matthew O'Coin. He wrote a book called The Impossible Art about his love of opera. He's like 30 years old, and he did the opera Eurydice that was at the Met during COVID. I've seen him compared to Mozart. I mean, he's a really an up-and-coming composer. And he's here with Magdalena Kuzma, who's a soprano. She's in the Met's Young Artist Program, which is a really prestigious program. And she's going to be performing here. That's going to be amazing. And that's Sunday, the 26th. So please come to that. You can register for both of those as well. Our speaker today, Kerri Greenidge, is the author of The Grimkes. She's a professor at Tufts. This book has been getting an enormous amount of good attention. It was on the cover of the New York Times Book Review. It was one of the New York Times' 10 best books of the year, among many, many other accolades. And so we're very lucky to have her here. She was just at, if you saw our program with Stacy Schiff, she was just at the 92nd Street Y being interviewed by Stacy Schiff a week or two ago. We're grateful to her for coming down here today. And our moderator today is Harold Holzer. You might have seen him around town at the country store or wherever else. He lives here in Rye. He's also the director at Roosevelt House, and he's a quite renowned Lincoln scholar. He's written a number of acclaimed books about Lincoln, including Lincoln and the Power of the Press, Lincoln at Cooper Union, and many others. So we're very lucky to have this conversation today. Harold, take it away.
Suzanne, thank you for your leadership here and for asking me to do this. What an honor to be with Kerri Greenidge, who I met for the first time about a minute and a half ago. So this is going to be very unrehearsed, but of course, read the book and read the lavish, brilliant reviews. The Grimkes is subtitled "The Legacy of Slavery in an American Family." So I think we should send this right to Florida after this discussion. Make sure they have it on all the bookshelves in Florida. But Kerri, what your book reminded me from first page to last is how complicated families were or could be because of the kind of hypocritical blindness of men who owned enslaved people and the abusive behavior and the rape and the then not ignoring of family ties. So I would say that this is was a revelatory book for me. And by the way, it goes without saying that I urge you to get a copy before you go home today, because it will change your attitude about slavery, about Southern people, about abolitionists. So enough glib summaries from me. I just want to get right to Kerri. Tell me first, because I know your previous book was about William Monroe Trotter, the editor, and we exchanged an email about him and about that project. But what drew you to tackle this complex story? And did you know how complex it was when you got into it?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I was sent you an email, and I said that your book about Lincoln and the Press was one of the books I looked at for my first book. So I'm like, but the best part about this part of my job is being able to meet people whose work I admire. So thank you so much for being here. And so I started encountering the Grimke name when I was doing research for the book that became the biography of William Monroe Trotter. And their name appeared in the black press pretty regularly from about 1860 all the way to the 1930s. And so I just kept making notes sort of on the side about how ubiquitous they were. And it really wasn't until I started to do the research that I realized how much of their story had to be told as a family story, as opposed to choosing one of them to do a biography about, because they were also had such complicated relationships to one another and to their past. And their letters, the primary source is kind of their letters and the archive. And when you go into the letters at the Clements Library in Michigan or at the Moreland Spingarn at Howard University in DC, they're talking about their family without talking about their family, which was sort of fascinating to me. And so that's what really drew me to the subject, but also as I began to do the research, made it much more complex than I probably thought going into it.
Yeah, I'll say,
Yes,
judging
yes.
from the result. But so you didn't know all of the layers of the onion that you'd have to peel back when you started.
Well, I knew about, so as a child, I grew up, my grandparents, neither of whom went to college, but were very, very into history, and particularly Black history, and they saved everything. And my grandfather, when I was about in second grade, we had a unit on the Grimkes sisters. And I remember coming home and being very fascinated by these women, and they were slaveholders, and yet they came to the North. And my grandfather saying, well, you have to know about Archibald Grimke because he lived in Boston. And he was related to them, but nobody ever talks about them. And so and that was from my grandfather, and but people know. And so when you get older, and if you become a historian, he would always say, when you become a historian, you need to look into him. And so I knew about them, but I had never seen them talked about together, unless the Black family was kind of the footnote, or in the story of the Black people, the white family was the footnote. And so I really wanted to, and considering how much they talked about each other in their private correspondence and letters and writings, I really wanted to concentrate on them as kind of this unit, very dysfunctional unit, but a unit nonetheless. Yep.
I mean, so there's that thread, of course. There's also the feminist thread, which we'll
Yes.
get to in a minute. And I like the fact that you picked sisters to be the basis of the book because you come from a writing family of sisters, right?
Yes. Yes.
Kirsten and Caitlin, Hunter
Yes.
MFA. I work at Hunter College,
Yes.
so we're very proud of Caitlin in the fine arts program.
Yeah.
So as you were, I just have to ask you this personal
Yes,
question
yes,
before we get into the Grimkes.
Yes, no problem.
So as you're writing, do you relate as these are two creative sisters,
Yes.
meaning the Grimkes, and you're three creative sisters? Do you see it in that perspective as well as you're working?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So I was writing this. I started working on this book right before COVID, and then COVID hit, and had a huge chunk of research left to do, and so I had to actually write to the Clements Library, and this is why librarians are brilliant, because I kept writing to them and being like, I can't get to the archive, and so they scanned me all this stuff, and so I was looking at the material as we were hunkered down during COVID lockdown in our house in Westboro, Massachusetts, with my sisters and my family. So I live in a house with my older sister, her husband, her two kids, and my mother. And then my younger sister, Caitlin, the novelist,
Right.
at the start of COVID, fled Brooklyn with her 2-month-old and came and lived with us. So we were all in there packed in together in this house with a beautiful, we have like an acre of land, very fortunate that we were in there together. So I think it's like an interesting question because I think I was writing and doing the research as I was hunkered down with family and as all the dynamics between sisters and families was kind of at a boiling point, as I think we all were during COVID, right? And so I think a lot of that informed how I looked at the relationships between the family members, and specifically between the Sarah and Angelina Grimke, the white Grimke sisters, and their relationship to their own family, and then to the family that they create when they left the South.
But what a family that must have been in their house.
Yes.
They have a family that their white mother shares, and a family that the father starts with one of the people he quote owns, unquote.
Yes.
So tell us, we're in the middle, but let's start at the beginning. Who were Sarah and Angelina Grimke? That's the principal question of the day.
Yes, so Sarah and Angelina Grimke were sisters from Charleston, South Carolina. The Grimke family at the turn of the right after the Revolution was one of the leading families in the Southern Low Country, but also in terms of the country in general. Their father actually was in England when the Revolutionary War began and was one of the people who coaxed Benjamin Franklin to return from Europe and come back to the United States. Their father ended up serving in the Revolutionary War and was also one of the wealthiest slaveholders in the history of that region. And eventually became mayor of Charleston, and then became a jurist and a politician who published a book that is still considered kind of the foundational text for law in the state of South Carolina, right? So all of South Carolina law presently emerges from the book that he published in the 1790s. So that's their family. Their mother was from an equally sort of prestigious Southern slaveholding family, and the sisters were 2 of 13 children born to this family of immense wealth and immense privilege. The oldest sister, Sarah Grimke, was brilliantly smart, very articulate, very loved learning, wanted to become a lawyer, but of course she was a girl in the family, and her father allowed her to basically prepare his briefs for court, but didn't allow her to become an attorney because he said if she was a boy, he would have sent her to law school, but she was a girl, and so all she could do was sort of do this work within his office. Sarah, the oldest sister, ended up, after their father died, fleeing Charleston because she had always been disgusted by slavery. And so the Grimke family, white Grimke family, owned between 1750 and the end of the Civil War, over 350 people. And so Sarah had always been uncomfortable with that, and particularly the extreme violence that she saw and talked about. She flees to Philadelphia. She tries to convert to Quakerism, and eventually became an abolitionist. Her youngest sister, Angelina, who was the youngest of the 13, was 13 years younger than Sarah, grows up in the house kind of after her sister leaves and starts to have her own qualms with slavery, slaveholding, and kind of what the plight of white women in the South is, and eventually fled herself to Philadelphia. And from there, the 2 sisters became famous for writing 2 of the kind of foundational texts of feminism, white feminism in the United States, and of linking that movement to the anti-slavery movement in 1838 and 1839. By 1838, Angelina made history as the first woman in the country to speak before a legislative body on political themes. So she addressed the Massachusetts state legislature. She's horribly excoriated by even people who are supposedly friends of hers for speaking out about the rights of women and the need for immediate emancipation. By 1840, Angelina married an equally prominent and controversial abolitionist named Theodore Dwight Weld, and the 3, Angelina, her husband Weld, and then her older sister Sarah, moved to the New Jersey countryside. And sort of that's kind of the story that you're told about the Grimkes, is that they're these women who disavowed their slaveholding past, fled to the north, make this mark in founding and cultivating and supporting early feminist movements, and that's kind of where the story stops. And so my sort of entry into it was looking at the relationship to the enslaved woman who had 3 sons with their brother. They had a brother named Henry, who became a lawyer in Charleston. And Henry had 4 children by his white wife, but then had a woman named Nancy Weston, who he had a relationship with. Many historians have referred to this relationship as somehow consensual. Somehow Henry Grimke was a kind master. I read in a lot of accounts that he would have freed her had he been able to, and he wasn't able to. And he has 3 children with Nancy Weston, Archibald, Francis, and John. And in 1852, Henry died. Those boys were 2 toddlers, so Archie was 3, Frank was 2, and John was about to be born, so he wasn't yet born. Henry died and left his Nancy and the 3 boys enslaved. Those 3 boys ended up escaping to the north, or going to the north after the Civil War, and had sort of these illustrious careers in their own right. Archie became one of the first black graduates of Harvard Law School. and owned a very prestigious law firm, black-owned law firm in Boston. Eventually was very involved in black politics and became head of the Massachusetts State Hospital in Westboro, which is the town I live in, during the 1880s. Eventually became ambassador to the Dominican Republic, a founder of the NAACP, a friend of W.E.B. Du Bois, and eventually moved to D.C. His brother Frank became one of the first black graduates of Princeton Seminary. And became the head Presbyterian minister of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, which was the most exclusive black church in the country, located in Washington, D.C. It's where sort of all of these leaders of the black community attended. And so, not to go on too long, but they're a big family, so, and they're all named Francis and Sarah and Angelina, so it's very confusing. But really trying to look at what was the relationship between those white sisters, right, who have come from the South to Philadelphia, are famous in the press, famous in the North, lauded in the North, and then they discover, in quotes, their nephews in the late 1860s by reading a newspaper article. They see the name Grimke. Sarah immediately writes to Archie. The two boys were students at Lincoln University, a black university in rural Pennsylvania. The Grimke sisters write and ask if they are related to the Grimkes. The boys say yes, and Sarah and Angelina then become involved in partially paying for their education and bringing them into their lives. But what I was really interested in is was that story true, right? That account that we've been told, given the trauma that I saw in the poetry of Angelina Grimke, who was Archibald's daughter. Who became a very famous black poet and playwright in the Harlem Renaissance, and published a play called Rachel, which is one of the first and sort of very anthologized play about lynching that appeared in 1916. So, yes.
So, by the way, Professor Greenidge has, I guess, a cast of characters at the beginning of the book, which is, helpful to the readers, but also testament to the complexity, the endless complexity of the family. So just to go back for a second, how unusual was the defiance of these conscience-struck daughters, Angelina and Sarah? And tell us a little bit about your fascinating interpretation of their abolitionist instinct, which is that part of it was kind of seeking of redemption as opposed to an acknowledgement of equality, because I find that to be at the heart of a lot of the book.
Yes, so I was very interested in the ways in which white abolitionists talked to and revered the Grimke sisters versus the way that black abolitionists in Philadelphia talked about the Grimke sisters. And the black abolitionists, there's a family called the Fortin family. James Fortin was one of the wealthiest sailmakers in Revolutionary America, a black man living in Philadelphia. He had this huge illustrious family of his own. He helps found the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And when Sarah and Angelina moved to Philadelphia, they enter a black community in Philadelphia that had been activists, going back to the 1770s. And yet the black community would often talk amongst themselves about the brilliance of the Grimke sisters. At the same time, the Grimke sisters failed to acknowledge that they're living in Philadelphia at a time when there's this severe racial system that they are benefiting from, right? So talking about, for instance, the Grimke sisters lived in Philadelphia when there are these horrible anti-black riots that take place constantly between about 1834 up to the 1840s, where white mobs go into the black community, completely tear apart the community, burn down the churches, and those incidents are covered widely in the press. They are so devastating that the local press in Philadelphia talks about, burning buildings and all these types of things. And the Grimke sisters live like a block away, and they never mention it in their writing. They never talk about this. And when, in fact, the black women who they know, who are also activists, sort of talk to them about instances of racism and segregation within their own lives, it's like there's a disconnect. And so I was very interested in the ways in which white abolitionists could be, at their hearts, anti-slavery. So they genuinely believed slavery was a sin, slavery was wrong, it was evil, it was horrible. They're writing very eloquently about the ways in which slavery had to end, and that it had to end immediately. And they're speaking eloquently about the rights of women. And yet there was a disconnect about how they're actually relating to black people when black people are actually talking to them, right? And there was a very big disconnect on how they saw their own lives in relationship to black people when they're working in Philadelphia, which at the time had a black population of about 15 to 20%. They're living right next to that community. They're interacting with that community. At one point, they go to a Quaker meeting house, and 2 black members are in that are in that meeting house, and the black members are not allowed to participate within the ceremonies. They have to sit below the stairs. And the Grimke sisters kind of don't really acknowledge this at the same time that they are going to these things. So I was very interested in what does that actually look like and what does that actually mean, that you have people who are generally anti-slavery, brilliant. They eventually, when they retire to their life in the New Jersey countryside, both the Grimke sisters and their husband ran a school that was integrated. And that taught both boys and girls, right? And so all these abolitionists and reformers send their children there. It's a brilliant school. And yet they have this disconnect with actual black people in their lives, right? And so where does that come from? It's sort of what
including their own family.
Including their own family, including the enslaved people, over 350 enslaved people that are owned by their family, including not a big disconnect on the fact that the reason they were able to survive in Philadelphia as single women was because their family were millionaires owning slaves and trading in them, right? And so I was really interested in that, right? That thing, and that's why I like the an American family. I think that's kind of at the heart of a lot of America's racial issue, is that you can have it be that intimate. And that you can have people who genuinely believe that slavery and racism are wrong, and yet when it comes to interacting with actual people, right, and actually having to reckon with the way that their lives are benefiting, there was see no evil, hear no evil, right, the type of mentality. Yep.
I have to say one of the major strengths among many strengths of this book, as far as I'm concerned, and I'll tell you a little story about how grateful I am to you for one particular element, is beautiful descriptions, evocative descriptions of place. So if you've read about Philadelphia, the city of, I'm doing quotation marks, city of brotherly love, it's a scary portrait. Charleston is beyond belief as a city of fear and solitude and limited rights and limited, opportunity to speak. So my tip of the hat to you, and I will actually say it I'm writing a book on immigration in America.
Oh, wow.
And I was very, and particularly as it involved Lincoln's career and his evolving attitude. So I'm happily writing about Philadelphia, right? Thinking I know something. Mm-hmm. I didn't until I read this. I knew something, but not everything. And in 1844, there were, as you mentioned in passing, because it's not on topic for you, there were huge anti-Catholic riots, devastating anti-Catholic, anti-Irish riots. What I didn't have, of course I put it in with a footnote to you, is that 10 years before, there was this, what was it called? Something horse for the carousel?
Flying horses riot.
Flying horses at a carousel where black people dared to go to a public park, right? And so this city of brotherly love is deconstructed by Professor Greenidge and written about in an entirely new way. A little scary. So tell us, the story it's not just about the Grimke sisters' delayed understanding of their tangential roots and dealing with it in their way. It's also a harrowing story of violence, which is kind of sanctioned, permitted, legal.
Yeah.
The violence of several generations of this white patriarchy against black children is absolutely frightening beyond belief and tolerated, right, by women, by mothers, by sisters. And the Grimkes eventually knew about it. I'm sure that the nephews told her. But tell us, I mean, we need to hear it. So if you could tell us a little bit about that, quote, home life.
Yeah. One of the things that was most difficult writing about Sarah and Angelina was that they were so disgusted by enslavement and slavery because they lived and actually saw it, and they were actually they're known as sort of the first white women who were slaveholders who actually talked about what slavery actually was. So by the 1830s, Southern and slaveholding states had come out with all this language about how slavery wasn't that harmful. Slaves were actually happy. Slavery itself was not violent, because why would you be violent towards something that's property? And it's really this lucrative system. And so the Grimkes sisters, if they did anything, they did many things, was that they really exposed that lie, because they grew up both in Charleston, in the city, and then their family had various plantations in the countryside. And so Sarah, especially the oldest sister, grew up spending part of the year on the plantation, and then the other part of the year in Charleston. And so she talks about just the ways in which the black people were policed on these huge plantations. I don't know if anyone's been to South Carolina or Mississippi and seen actually what plantations were. And so it's like one house where the white family lives, and then there's, enslaved people there, and then there's nothing else for miles around, right? And so Sarah, one of her earliest memories as a child, was running away from the house. And as she's trying to leave, she's like 5 years old, she's trying to leave, she realizes there's no way to go. She turns around and she sees, and, trigger warning, it's sort of very, 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 very violent. She sees a slave's head on a stake. And she runs away, and the black nurse comes and gets her and brings her in and basically says, well, that's because he tried to escape, and so that's to prevent the other slaves people from escaping, right? And so she's like 5, and this is kind of just a casual thing that's talked about for the black people, of course, is terrifying. For a child who's 5 years old, who's on her family property and sees a head of somebody, and nobody's talking about it. Growing up in Charleston, the newspaper reports, you're talking about the vivid description, is like, I'm all about looking at primary sources and newspaper articles. So newspaper articles in Charleston talked about how, the famous hotels that were in Charleston, that Charleston was known for, is kind of this epicenter of the global South, would now call it, that black people were the people who worked in those hotels and had to sleep standing up, because they had to be on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So, and people talking about going to these hotels, and I arrived from New Orleans at 3 a.m, and I had to kick the black man because he was sleeping standing up. His eyes should have been open when I got out of my carriage. And so it's very subtle things like that were just part of the culture, and the violence that was part of the culture, and the way it was reported on in the press, and the way people talked about it in their papers, which were very sort of these casual ways of talking about the ways in which enslavement, particularly in Charleston, was this very brutally violent system, and that people were growing up around it and going to school under it, and seeing somebody. There's a story that Sarah told about being in their front parlor, and their mother, Polly Smith Grimke, was terrified that slaves were stealing food, and so she kept all the food locked up, and she kept the keys to the cabinets at her side, and she wouldn't let the enslaved people anywhere near the food, even the cook. So when the cook had to cook, the cook had to come in, get the key. Mrs. Grimke would watch her, and if there was she suspected anyone was taking any food, that she would then not let the slaves eat. So it's this type of violence that I found just all sprinkled all over kind of the stories that they're talking about as they're talking about other things in their family, which can often be a sign, in families or in communities when the violence is kind of just talked about as an afterthought, right, rather than the main event.
And the white people are discussing the violence that will no doubt be directed against them if liberties are given, right? That's part of the
exactly right. So Charleston, in particular, many southern cities had this. It wasn't just Charleston, but Charleston had something called the workhouse, which was actually a jail where if you owned an enslaved person and that person was not behaving correctly, you would send them to this workhouse. And basically, the person was tortured, and the yard was open so that people in the city could see this happening. And so, if you were a slaveholder, you would send your enslaved person to the workhouse. They could be there anywhere from 3 days to 4 months. And the sort of ways in which I looked at the records of the workhouse, and the descriptions of it, both in the press and also by the workhouse keepers themselves, and kind of the horrendous ways in which that was used to police the black community, and to the fact that that workhouse was sanctioned and paid for by tax dollars. So people voted for to have this system in there, right? Because they were slaveholders, and what am I going to do with my enslaved people when they try to run away? And they built this. So the violence to me was kind of the heart of the story of how it was that both the white Grimkes and the black Grimkes, their nephews, had this disconnect often between their professed political values and kind of what was actually happening on the ground.
And of course, if you've been to Charleston itself, you may remember that the main houses are sometimes backed by walled cities where enslaved people lived and no windows out into the streets. So
Exactly.
no escape, no way of communicating,
No,
no way of saying help. So it's a pretty grim society. I mean, I was astonished by the violence of relatives on each other. So, I mean, I can't look into their heads. You probably can, but did they not think that there was any blood relation that they needed to maybe not respect, but take account of in the beatings? The guy who beats people on the head all the time, whether it's his butler or his relative, it's just it's horrifying. But there was no cognizance of protection. Even if it's protection of property, it's a stupid way to behave.
Yeah. I mean, it is a stupid way to behave. But I think, that people have done fascinating histories and writings about slavery, and particularly Southern slavery. And in order for slavery to survive, you have to have violence. And you also always have to have the threat of violence. Because otherwise, Charleston was a majority black city. So 57% of the population was black, the rest was white. And so the moment you get rid of any kind of violence, or very, very severe violence, heads on stakes. Women, one of the punishments was starving enslaved women, particularly when you thought that they were having relationships with white men. And this is happening in the city, and people are seeing this happening. But that's the only way you're going to keep this system intact, if people are so terrified, enslaved people especially, but also just people in your household who are white people in your household, right? And make it so terrifying that people trying to just accept that this is the way that it is. And so I think that I had read that, of course, I'm a historian, so I know that theoretically, and I know all the literature, but to actually read about it and hear them talking about it was pretty hard for me to do as I was writing the book.
In one, I know I'm skipping around, but in one section, you say that one of the young men who was the child of Henry didn't speak often to his abusive relative. I was astonished that he said anything or spoke at all, but he did, right?
Yes. So you're talking about Henry and Stephen?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Henry is the brother who ends up having a relationship with Nancy Weston. Henry, in all of the family papers of the white Grimkes, was known from being, as a small child, as being very violent. And one of my things that I kind of could look at is if, my mother's a social worker and she deals with trauma and communities and stuff. And so I would, as I was writing this, we're all in the house, I would go to her and be like, this is like a textbook case of like a child who's in a family, a white child who's in a family where there's all this violence and the child takes it out on other people in the household who are smaller or weaker than they are. And so Henry grows up to be this horribly violent man. So much so that there are white people who are equally violent who complain about his behavior to the Grimkes, right? He ended up going to the college at Charleston College, got kicked out for beating up and people and misbehaving, eventually got married, and has this relationship with Nancy Weston. But the casualty of all that was that he, as a child, one of the enslaved people was named Stephen, and Stephen was like the enslaved boy who grew up next to Henry. So each of the children had an enslaved person who helped them, and this boy's name was Stephen. And in all the letters, they talk about how violent Henry was to Stephen from the time they were little kids. So he'd take his head and bang it against bricks, push him into walls, push him off of ledges, watch him sort of fall down and faint and bang his head and sort of laugh about it and all these type of things. And so now they're adults, and Stephen suffers from fits, as they call them in the 19th century. He has what probably were seizures. I don't really know. and the Grimkes decide that the grown Stephen is now no longer valuable, and so they are trying to decide what to do with him. And so eventually the Grimke sisters, the abolitionist ones, agree to purchase him and bring him to New Jersey. The problem that I saw in that was the way that the Grimke sisters talked about Stephen when he got to New Jersey. So here's this man, horrendous abuse. They were in the house when the abuse was happening. He moves to New Jersey. He can't function, so he can't hold a job. He has at least 4 seizures a day. He's incontinent, all of these things. And the Grimke sisters, all they can say is that he's lazy. Right? Why doesn't he just work? This is what slaves need. They need to get out of slavery, and they need to work, and then they're going to learn the value of $1, right? And so their reaction to Stephen is completely out of the realm of what actually the environment is.
So one of the things you say about Sarah and Angelina is, as earnest as their anti-slavery is, they don't acknowledge what you call their privilege. Mm-hmm. I mean, put them if you would, in the context of other abolitionists of the period. How much are you expecting of them? So I guess I'm asking do you expect too much, or do you expect more than they can give, or are there others who understand more about?
It's an interesting question. So as I was writing the book, I was concerned with that, and I was always trying to compare them or look at them in relationship with other white women who they worked with. So Lucretia Mott, for instance, who was a Quaker woman, abolitionist, very close to the Grimke sisters, was somebody who was constantly trying to talk to the black community about what her own weaknesses were as an activist, right? So Lucretia Mott is equally wealthy, equally esteemed, grows up, albeit in New England and in Pennsylvania, but throughout her career is writing to black women abolitionists saying, I as a white woman don't understand this dynamic. Can you help me? The Grimke sisters don't do that. Similarly, you have somebody like a Charles Sumner in Massachusetts, becomes senator, who agrees to apprentice black law students in his office during the 1840s and 1850s, because he would say it didn't matter that if this person was going to become a lawyer. It mattered that he was in a position to become a mentor to a younger person and give them a credential so that they could leave the country and become, whatever they wanted to become. So I think there were people in the Grimke's time, particularly the Grimke sisters, many people who they knew who had a very different relationship to black people and acknowledged in the limited ways that they could that they didn't have that they were benefiting in some ways. So you have someone like a Lucretia Mott who stops buying anything made out of sugar because she recognizes that sugar is produced by slave labor. At one point, a group of abolitionists start to realize all their clothing is created by cotton, and so they stop purchasing that, and they actually make a point of buying stuff from black tailors who are making clothing that are made out of burlap instead, right? So there's these, and the Grimke sisters kind of don't make that leap except for very superficially. So in that sense, I saw them as being slightly indicative of a mindset amongst white abolitionists, but also a mindset that ignored the possibilities that could have been there for them to go further.
You think that might be because Sarah's from 3/4 of a generation ahead or behind Angelina, and she's kind of a mother figure in the book? You think she inhibits Angelina's development, maybe not directly, but kind of by osmosis?
Oh, of course, yes. And one of the heartbreaking things was seeing in these papers how the way that white children in slaveholding families were raised, which was that they weren't raised by their parents. They're black people are raising them. There's a black woman who nurses all of the Grimke children. She doesn't nurse her own children. She nurses all of them. And the fact that Angelina in particular, the youngest daughter, sort of was very neglected in the sense that, emotionally, particularly once Sarah left for Philadelphia. She's sort of this young teenager and she has no one to talk to, right? And she talks about how she's lonely. And her family's saying, well, your job, it doesn't matter if you're lonely, your job is to get married, right? As a Southern woman, right? You're not supposed to be having feelings, right? And so when they moved together as a unit, both sisters, Sarah definitely becomes kind of that parenting figure. So much so that it's Sarah who helps raise Angelina's own children, who she seems very incapable in the letters that I read of raising herself when they're in New Jersey. Yeah.
I told you it was complex, right?
Yes.
It is complex. I was taken with the segues you made into the life of Theodore Dwight Weld as well. I like your descriptions of his wild hair.
Yes.
Yes, I took it personally, but you didn't know me then, so it's okay. And his resistance to women in the movement. So again, your book is also pivoting in kind of the nexus of racism and sexism.
Yes.
So what was his problem? He's got this amazing feminist wife, kind of a feminist wife, and sister-in-law, but he's not all in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the difference between our political ideals and actually our day-to-day functioning in lives, right? So Theodore Dwight Weld, when he gets married to Angelina, their wedding is like this show of sort of reformist culture, and they have a black minister and a white minister. They wear only naturally produced clothing to get married. They refuse to. She refuses to take his name because it's going to be that they're both independent beings, and so they're very, very progressive in all of that. And yet he's very resistant to the idea of the Grimke sisters touring the North, right, and speaking in public, right. That was something that he kind of struggled with. Although he supports them once they do it, right? Behind the scenes, he's sort of, oh, you're too delicate, right? You're going to get sick. This is why, you shouldn't be doing these things. Similarly, when he has a daughter of his own, he has this notion that daughter, so these are Angelina Grimke's daughter, should be sissy, should sort of take care of her brothers. And that her brothers one of the brothers has sort of some sort of mental health issues, and that she should take care of Sodi. And yes, you want to go to school, but your job as the girl in the family is to take care of your brother. So I think it really just speaks to the complexities of politics and good intentions and activism versus real life, and the practicalities of that some people see of what actually happens when you're relating to people in your own family or in your own community, beyond kind of the lofty ideas that you have and that you know to be true.
So Archie and Frank kind of become part of what you called the Black elite, right? But you have a strong message about our misconceptions about the Black elite as well, that readers, particularly white readers, perhaps are told about the opportunities they seize, but perhaps they're feel-good stories that need to be explored from a different point of view. Could you elaborate on that as well?
Yeah, and I really owe this to, there's a bunch of historians like Du Bois talked about this, Jacqueline Moore talked about it as well. There's this class that emerges after the Civil War that's this Black elite. Most of them are descendants of enslaved Black women and white men from the South, so they're much like Archie and Frank. And that group ends up having all of these successes. So Archie goes to Harvard. He's having conversations with President Grover Cleveland, who appoints him to this post in the Dominican Republic. And Frank is down in Washington, D.C., and he's consorting with, leaders in the Senate at the time about, paving the roads so that Black people can have, this church and all these things. So they're very esteemed and accomplished, and yet the ways in which they talked to each other, and particularly the ways they talked about Black people in the community who they did not consider of their class, was problematic, to say the least, and often reflected the language that the Grimke sisters used to talk about Black people when they came to Philadelphia. And so, there's one letter that I did notes on, that's Archie to his brothers in the 1890s, and I underlined, and the same words that he used are the same words that Angelina uses when she's talking about Stephen in the 1840s. Lazy, coal-colored, to refer to the skin color. The fact that there's a class of Black people who can never be saved. And so they're speaking in the same way. And so I really was interested in, that enslavement isn't just the legacy of slavery in America I would say, from a historical perspective, isn't just the way that it contributes to all these systems that we now have. It's the way that even, Black people can talk about themselves and the ways that they can then raise their children in ways that are, and seemed at the time to be the most prudent, but then have these effects on that community and those children.
And then the book kind of ends with I guess to make it most complex of all, there are two Angelinas, two Nanas.
Yes.
And Nana being a name, not a grandma. And
Yeah.
then it ends with this extraordinary woman who is independent, pioneer, creative spirit, a gay woman, breaking other barriers, and yet we don't know that much about her today. So thank you for opening that window.
Yeah.
But tell us a little bit about her. I know you did at the very beginning, but her extraordinary life writing and producing and breaking all sorts of barriers in the Harlem Renaissance.
Yeah, so Archie's daughter was named Angelina. Again, too many Angelinas. They're called Nana. And Archie married a white woman in Boston. It was quite the scandal at the time. So, and that woman, when Angelina was born, they're living in Boston. Everything appears to be going okay. Archie is working as an attorney. And then one day, his wife picks up and leaves with the 2-year-old Nana to Michigan and then informs him that she wants a divorce. And she raises Angelina in Michigan in a predominantly, from what I could tell, all-white environment, and doesn't really acknowledge that her child is Black, except when she's mad at Angelina. And then she talks about her being sort of this bad Black thing, right? She then decides suddenly when Angelina was about 7 that she needed to be around her own people. She literally puts the child on a train with a thing around her neck and sends her from Detroit by herself all the way to Boston and says, Archie, you raise her. And so this Nana grows up with her father at once a man and a father who's very doting, so he sends her to all these private schools. He has her, she spends a lot of time with a wealthy white woman from Norwood, Massachusetts, who sort of takes her in and gives her this dollhouse and takes her to etiquette lessons, and she's having sort of this very charmed life, as it looks like on the outside. But then on the inside, all the letters, and there's just hundreds and hundreds of letters between her and her father and her family, is nothing this child, then become young woman, then become older woman, does is correct in the eyes of her father. From the fact that she's extremely creative and writes and draws from the time she's like 3 years old, and I actually have little images of her writing and drawing to him from Michigan when she's like 3, and writing, and him saying she has bad handwriting, right? She finally gets to Boston, and they're worried about her because they say that she is not nice to her white cousins, and that she sort of is unruly. She then goes to school. Archie, her father, goes to the Dominican Republic. She goes down and lives in D.C. with her aunt and uncle. And it quickly becomes clear that she's not very interested in school, so she keeps like failing out of the prestigious Black high school that's there. And then it's discovered that she's having sexual relationships with a woman, another Black girl. Family freaks out. They send her to school in Minnesota, to Carrollton, becomes Carrollton College. There, she ends up having an affair with 2 women, both of whom are white. They then take her out of that school. They bring her back to Boston. And so everything this poor girl does is like, everything is wrong. And the way they talk to her father talked to her uncle, 2 Black men talk to her often that, she as a Black woman has to be a certain way. And that she's a traitor to the race if she doesn't behave a certain way. And she's a failure because she goes to school and she doesn't do very well and she kind of flunks out. But then Archie manages to get her into another school and she does well. She then becomes a teacher. And so everything she does is wrong. And not only that, everything she does in the eyes of kind of this very wealthy Black community is wrong, right? She's considered kind of loose. She's a writer. She produces, we now have just a fraction published of what she actually wrote. If you go into her archive, she has, hundreds and hundreds of poems and novels and plays that she wrote that are very, very complex. They're kind of like Ezra Pound, like the way that she uses language and lack of punctuation and the way she plays with kind of mood and all these types of things is brilliant. And her family didn't like that until, of course, she starts to publish in newspapers when she's about 12, and then they start to like it. But they don't like what she's writing about, right? Because they say, well, why are you writing about these abstract things? She was very abstract, so everything is kind of like allusion and not, rhyme scheme. And she's really experimenting with rhyme scheme, and they don't like that, right? It's what's wrong with you? Why can't you just write a poem that's A, B rhyme scheme, right? And so everything she does was considered bad by her family, despite the fact that Archie publicly is bragging that he has this brilliant daughter. And I really saw that and dissected that in terms of that dissonance between kind of what happens within the family versus what is presented to the public.
So in the end, it's a book about borders in a way, scaling them, erecting them, overcoming them, not getting past them. It's an American story, but it's not one I think that we're used to, and that's why I found it so revelatory. Kevin, do we have time for a few questions? All right, so I don't know if I should surrender my microphone, or do you have another? He's going to... There's one here. Can he just stand up? Or?
So when Nana's mother takes her to Michigan, and into an all-white community, does she try to pass her as white? Do we know that?
We don't know that. So one of the things I was very careful to do is that, the history of passing often is seen as people immediately choosing to pass, which did happen. But we're also in the 1880s when there's kind of this fluidity regarding race and color, where many people who were lighter skinned they'd go into a situation and people would assume they were white and they just wouldn't correct them. But that didn't mean that they were white. She doesn't try to pass her off as white, but she does live in a community. So Nana's mother's father was a minister. And so he's taking the family on all these places to minister to these mostly white communities in Michigan. And nobody mentions that she's black. And in fact, there's an allusion to that she's out playing when she's like 6 years old, and some kid starts throwing rocks at her, and her mother says, "Well, just tell them you're an Indian. You're an Indian person, right?" And Angelina, being Angelina, saying, "The best blood of the South is in my veins," right? And that would maybe mean that she's might be black, it's the 1880s, but her mother not even responding, right? Which is kind of like the silences you get in family, right? So her mother just kind of leaving this child to her own devices to kind of be in this. So I don't think, to answer your question, I don't think it was like, I'm gonna take her here and she's gonna be white. It was more, I'm in this relationship with Archie that's difficult for all of its various reasons. I'm going to take my child and move to Michigan. I'm going to start over. We're in a white environment, and if I don't have to bring up race, I won't bring up race, right? And when it's brought up, I'll kind of just, have her deal with it, right?
Yes, right here.
First, I really look forward to reading the book. You mentioned the violent nature of the brother, Henry.
Mm-hmm.
Did that violence also extend to his relationship with his wife and to Nancy Weston?
It's a good question. So I didn't find evidence that he was specifically violent towards his white wife. However, I did find that his own children, his son Montague, was extremely violent and actually returned during the Civil War and took his little brothers who were black, Archie, Frank, and John, and brutalized them, right? So there's these stories of them being beaten to the street and Montague putting them in the workhouse and all these types of things. There's no evidence that he was abusive to his own children, and yet there's kind of this strand of violence that just goes through. Nancy Weston, the interesting thing about Nancy Weston is that she never learned how to read or write, which was very astonishing to me, that she was enslaved to the Grimkes, and she met the Grimke sisters. She knew them, and yet never learned how to read or write. For this family that talked all about books and reading, and we're going to teach she didn't learn how to read or write. I didn't get any specific examples of violence, but I did get examples of isolation, which was very common if you were a white man and you had a relationship with an enslaved woman, was to isolate that woman. So Nancy Weston was a part of a very large free black family. She herself was enslaved. And when Henry purchases her, he takes her to the countryside and puts her in a cabin by herself. And she doesn't interact with the other black people. But she does try to help them. So she gets them food because he had this thing about food, so he wouldn't feed them. She has her own garden. She tries to give them food to feed them. And at one point, Henry gets mad and goes to strike an enslaved person with a rake. And Nancy steps in, and he stopped right? Because that was his But so it's a complicated relationship. Like people do all these studies on historians far more talented than me who do all this study on like women and violence and the way that slave and plantation culture worked. And so Henry's relationship to his children, no overt evidence of violence. To his white wives, no overt evidence of violence. And yet you have this poor man, Stephen, whose brain is completely, shattered because of the violence of this person over a long period of time. So I kind of took that as an indication of what might have been happening, what might not have been happening in sort of situations.
Yes.
Nice to learn about history, the intellectual component of it. What do you want us to take from the white side, the black side, the mixed side, as how it relates to today? The taking it from that intellectual, oh, that's so sad, what happened, in terms of, well, why is that relevant today?
It's a good question. So I was writing this definitely during the time when three things were happening. Number one, there was, I don't know if you guys remember this, but like in 2018, 2019, there were all these thought pieces of, the way we'll get rid of racism is that there's a rise in mixed race people, right? And families now have black people are married to black people, and white people are married to black people are married to white people, and they have children, and there's more integration, and therefore racism will be solved. So that was the first thing. 2018, 2019, there were all these think pieces being written about that. Second thing that was happening was this notion that, white women and black people would somehow coalesce around common interests, and change the political tide of the country. And that didn't happen in 2020. 53% of white women voted for Trump in 2016, and 54% voted for Trump in 2020. The third thing that was happening as I was writing the book was this notion that, well, all black people have to do is like go to college and succeed, and when that happens, then all this racial stuff will go away. And in fact, there was a great article, Raj Chetty, who is an economist at Harvard, had an article in the New York Times that was all about, well, even the most wealthy black person, their likelihood of having success is the same or is less than a very poor white person, regardless of how much money their money. Did everyone see this article? And it had the graph, and this is based on years and years of research, right? Top 1% of black families, your children are more likely to end up poor than the bottom 2% of white families in this country. So that would seem to indicate that all these things that we're kind of thinking are gonna solve the American system, that's not true. And so I was really interested in, well, why isn't it true, right? And why do we keep on telling ourselves that this is the way we're gonna solve things, right? And so I really wanted to explore that within this family, because I think they're kind of the example of why that's not true, right? Until you deal with racism and violence and inequity within a community and within a family, not all the structural things, of course, all the economic things, of course, but just the ways that people interact on a very real level, we're just gonna keep having the same conversation, right? Because it's in families, that's how deep it is, right? And it's in the ways that black people experience racial violence from white people, how they then can turn that on themselves, right? And then what does that then mean? So that I think it's very relevant in terms of today, because I think I'm not that old, but it seems like every 10 years of my life there's like a conversation like, oh, we've reached it, we've solved the issue, right? Yay. And it's always the same conversation, right? It's always those same three things. Number one, white women and black people are going to unite, and they're like the wise people in here, and they'll get it together. Number two, black people just need to work harder and be better, and eventually things will happen. And then three, well, the solution is just to have black and white people getting together and having children, right? But black and white people have been having children since black and white people were invented, right? So that's not going to be a solution, right? And so I really, that's really sort of what I think the takeaway should be, is that we have to move beyond these things that we think, that we keep on saying are gonna solve it. We haven't really identified what it is, right? But that saying that same thing every 12 years hasn't made it true.
So I want to get everyone to the reception and book signing where you can talk to Professor Greenidge. I just want to say, I have to say that my friend David Reynolds, writing in the New York Review of Books, said that this book was tortuous. But I think he meant it in the best possible way, that this is a story that we have to confront and we have to read, particularly in Professor Greenidge's extraordinary version about elitism, marginalization, barriers, openings, opportunities, lost opportunities, because it not only can awaken us in an era when woke seems to be a dirty word and among half the country or more, but it can enlighten us. And I read this weekend that a new textbook, actually a leading textbook maker, yielded to a school board in Florida and removed from a description of Rosa Parks that she was asked to move to the back of the bus because she was black. They said she was asked to move to the back of the bus, ... with no explanation. This is a way of acknowledging that this story is complicated and needs to be told and read. So it's been a pleasure to talk to you about it.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.